Okay, let's go ahead and get things started. Again, I appreciate that you're taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I think this is going to be a fascinating topic. As we were preparing for it, I was reminded of the 1989 movie Field of Dreams with Kevin Costner. And I'm going to paraphrase the famous line, if you build it, they will come. And the infrastructure, of course, is one of the first things that has to really get rolling along with the aircraft for advanced air mobility. Lest people think that we're getting ahead of ourselves, I will say that Mike Hirschberg and some of our friends over at the Vertical Flight Society just issued a press release this week. And their eVTOL aircraft directory now contains 500 different concept aircraft. So that's kind of an amazing number. It includes both electric and hybrid aircraft. So we know that we're on the right topic today. We do have some great panelists. I'd like to introduce them. Start out with Diana Cooper, who is head of US policy with Hyundai Air Mobility. We have Addison Ferrell, who's head of Americas at Skyports. He's also a mechanical engineer. Dr. Marcus Johnson is the subproject manager for Aviation Systems Division at NASA Ames Research Center. We have Liza Josias, who leads human factors and stakeholder engagement at Air Mobility. And we have Sevan Mehrabian, Sevan, I just butchered that, I apologize, Mehrabian, who is the co-founder and co-leader of US Drone Services for Deloitte. This is an interactive webinar. We do encourage your participation. Look forward to hearing your questions. Please use the question module that's either on the bottom or side of your computer screen or your phone screen to ask the questions. We try to pay attention to the chat features, but the question feature will always be the highest priority for us. We will do our best to get to every question today. If not, we may be able to follow up with some other ones by email. This webinar is being recorded. If you would like to rewatch it or share it with somebody, we will have it posted on social media. We should be able to send it to you as well. As always, it's available on our website and our YouTube channel. And our website is rotor.org/webinars, where you'll find those. I would now like to introduce Sevan to join us, have him introduce his team, and we'll get the presentation started.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sevan Mehrabian. Thank you for the introduction, Dan. Thank you, HAI, for organizing this session. I will be your moderator today. I am a senior manager with Deloitte Consulting, one of the founders and leaders of our drone program that has existed for at least the past few years. And as a global consulting company, we have the unique opportunity to work with all kinds of different clients on this topic, everything from drones to advanced air mobility, counter UAS, and beyond. And we even ended up doing a really cool Vertiport market study recently and got a lot of cool input from HAI and HAI stakeholders. That being said, we'll introduce the rest of the panel members if they can come online on video. Marcus Johnson is having some technical issues, so hopefully he's able to, we can figure that out and he'll get on quickly. But let's start with you, Addison. If you could introduce yourself, tell us what your company is doing in this space, and we can go from there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sevan. As Dan mentioned, I'm head of Americas for Skyports. Based in Boston, I'm responsible for our commercial efforts in the region. Skyports was founded in 2017 to address the need for landing infrastructure that the AAM industry needs. We design, develop, and operate vehicle-agnostic vertiports.
All right, thank you for that, Diana.
Thank you, Sevan, and thanks to HAI for hosting this session. Really excited to be here today with everyone. I'm Diana Cooper. I lead US policy for Hyundai Urban Air Mobility. Prior to this, I served as Senior Vice President of Policy and Strategy at a commercial drone company. And before that, I developed the first drone practice group at a Canadian law firm. So I've been in the unmanned aircraft system space, starting with small drones and now with larger passenger carrying aircraft for the last 8 years or so. Hyundai, everyone knows it's a household name on the auto side. We've ventured out to build a new aviation division about a year and a half ago when I joined the company. We are very centered on developing human-centered multimodal mobility solutions and to provide really the full trip experience. So customers, they don't really care what mode they're taking for the most part. They just want to get to where they want to go ultimately in the most seamless fashion and in an accessible and affordable way. So we're really focused on that full trip experience and really working with other partners and regulators to develop not just the aircraft, but also the infrastructure and the ecosystem. So looking forward to doing a deeper dive into some of those issues later on in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. Lisa?
Hi, I'm Liza Josias. Thanks, Sevan, and to HAI for inviting us here today. Very excited to be here. I am leading the human factors and stakeholder engagement work at Eve Air Mobility. Eve is the first graduate independent company to spin out from Embraer X, the innovation arm of the Embraer aircraft company from Brazil. Eve is taking on a very integrated perspective on the UAM system. So apart from developing the eVTOL, we also are creating a suite of urban air traffic management systems, products to integrate the infrastructure. We are also thinking about the fleet operations, and we also offer products on services and supplies. So what we're doing is looking at what does the airspace need, what does the fleet operators need, what will the vertiport operators need, and Eve is really taking that whole integrated systems integration approach.
Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. And just a reminder for everyone, today we're going to talk about the implications and challenges and considerations for emerging vertiport infrastructure technology to enable AAM or advanced air mobility. With that, I think, and again, hopefully Marcus Johnson will join us soon. But a question for everyone, we can start with Diana. What is a vertiport to you? When you think of vertiports, what does that mean to you?
It's a great question, great place for us to start. There are already a lot of definitions that have been floated out there publicly by NASA, FAA, industry, and foreign CAs as well. So obviously it's an emerging concept. It's going to require some guidance from regulators on, what the standards are for something to actually be stood up legally from a regulatory perspective as a vertiport. But, from a layman's perspective, a vertiport is really a place to take off and land with electric vertical aircraft, which we're developing alongside other market players. And so it could be something smaller, like a Vertistop for only one aircraft, or something that's much bigger, more akin to a small airport or a helipad. So I think we're going to see a variety of models, both public and private, smaller, larger, multi-use or single-use vertiports over time.
Thank you, Diana. Addison, to you, you build vertiports. What does it mean to you? What's the definition of a vertiport?
Yeah, well, I think Diana, she said it very well. I see it as the physical infrastructure that's the linkage between the ground and air ops for VTOL aircraft. And of course, they'll take many forms, but I think what we'll see is something that ends up looking like a little bit of a hybrid of an airport and a heliport with some new technology thrown in there as well.
Perfect. Lisa?
Well, similar to Addison, Diana, I see a vertiport as a place where these eVTOLs will land, come and go. They'll have variations in sizes. There'll be just one landing pad, or maybe there'll be multiple. I also see them as a place where both passengers and cargo could come and go. There might be some sort of a cargo handling part of it, depending on the size. And there'll be a place where there'll be charging facilities for these new aircraft, where there'll be hydrogen or electricity. And of course, passengers will need to be processed in and out of there.
Perfect. If I can become a panel member Oh, Marcus is joining. Great. I was hoping he would say what I'm about to say. Well, let's pause. Marcus, can you introduce yourself? Thank you for joining. Sorry you were having technical issues. And introduce yourself and define for us what you think a vertiport is.
Thanks. My apologies for being late due to the technical issues. So I'm Marcus Johnson. I work at NASA Ames Research Center. I am the sub-project manager for an activity called High Density Vertiplex, which is basically looking at our UAM maturity level 4 type of operations, so like hundreds of operations out a little bit further in the future. Looking at how you automate and provide some automation services at the infrastructure of the vertiport itself. So we're doing some more foundational research in that area, contributing to NASA's national campaign effort, particularly focused on trying to accelerate technology development for the National Campaign 3, which is high density vertiports. So getting to your question, what is a vertiport? So there's a lot of, I guess, different definitions that are out there. NASA more recently contracted some work to look at trying to do a trade study on vertiport automation. And one of the first things that was at the question is, what is a vertiport? And we kind of more formally define it as, an identifiable ground or elevated area, including kind of buildings, facilities thereon, where you can take off and land from either a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft or a rotorcraft. More practically, though, one of the things that was identified and resonated with us at NASA is that vertiports come in all shapes and sizes. So we abstracted that a little within that trade study to talk about a vertiplace, which has kind of a different levels of infrastructure and different levels of capabilities associated with the facility itself. So what is a vertiport? It's many different things, but it's going to support many different types of operations. And we may need to, as an industry, look at how we categorize different types of vertiports, given the capabilities that they have. And again, apologize for being late, but that's what my thoughts are on what a vertiport is.
Thank you, Marcus. And to elaborate on your point, because I was part of that study you just discussed, we talked about vertiplaces as the umbrella terminology. So perhaps we should call this session vertiports, vertiplaces, not vertiports, to be consistent. And this is a report that you published, Marcus, so everyone can see it. But we define vertiplaces as the umbrella term. And as Liza mentioned, some basic functionalities such as charging, instrument approach procedures, weather monitoring, handling passengers, cargo, and then the three sub-levels under that, Verta hubs, Vertaports, and Verta stops. We define Verta hubs as sort of the large category facility that has most capability and function. You would see these in not urban areas, but outside of urban areas, sort of similar to airports, where they need larger physical space. And then vertiports, this is smaller versions of Verta hubs that are in urban areas for takeoff and landing, maybe on top of buildings. And then the smallest version, again, we ended up putting this in the study, Verta stops. This is the smallest version just for takeoff and landing in certain areas, and probably 1 or 2 pads at most. So that study's out. You guys can take a look, but thank you for that definition. So going back to Addison, for you, what do you see as some of the major challenges associated with building and operating vertiports? And specifically, maybe for this audience, do you think existing infrastructure, such as helipads, can be used to accelerate the development of vertiports, or do you think that they're very different?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's several challenges. Maybe I'll highlight one to start, which is the siting of the vertiports themselves. really the ideal location would be an open field, no airspace obstructions or restrictions in the middle of a dense urban area, co-located with other transport nodes. So in other words, it doesn't exist. So we really end up with a number of trade-offs and have to learn to work around suboptimal site characteristics. I think it's the first step in any of this is where to place these, and there are just some fundamental challenges there. In terms of using existing aviation infrastructure, absolutely it can be used or adapted for AAM to some fashion. For example, many helipads could have charging units brought to them so that eVTOLs could land there and recharge. However, if we want to achieve the dream of high volume, low cost, time saving and enjoyable flight, we're going to need fit for purpose vertiport infrastructure, just because the combination of location and throughput is meaningfully different than what existing infrastructure has been designed for. So it necessitates something new and different.
Thank you. Marcus, do you agree, disagree, anything to add?
Yeah, no, I do agree. I think, a lot of folks are looking at existing infrastructure right now as a potential kind of first step, and there's challenges with integrating in this existing infrastructure. I think you look at the heliports. A lot of the heliports in the U.S. certainly are private use facilities right now, and they certainly couldn't necessarily support things like the charging needs if it's an electric vehicle that's going to be taken off and landing at that facility. So in the near term, maybe airports are something that could facilitate, but there's challenges associated with integrating into the airspace when you start getting closer to those facilities. I think for it to be a little bit more scalable, we need to look a little bit broader and think about, maybe initial ops could leverage some very targeted sites in existing infrastructure, but more scalable solutions probably will need vertiport development, which meets the needs of the industry. And so, yeah, I agree with everything that Addison said. I think there's, some of the challenges is certainly getting community buy-in. Where are these particular vertiports going to be located at? How do they interact with the rest of the other modes of transportation? So a lot of open questions there. But I think, what we want to look for is making sure that these vertiports can support the scale and the business cases that are out there.
Thank you. Liza, what about you? What challenges have you observed doing what your company is doing?
Well, we've been looking at some concepts of operations. So working with Air Services Australia, we were looking at how vertiport operations as the whole from point A to point B from the Melbourne use case context. We're also currently looking at regulatory challenges in the UK. And from the vertiport perspective, we're integrating those challenges. Community acceptance is certainly one place where it's going to be a challenge. So stepping away from those nuts and bolts integration issues. I think communities need to not only accept the vertiports and the UAM operations, but also have a real understanding of what the potential benefits are, and those benefits need to be deliverable, not just empty promises. We also are challenged with understanding how to best integrate those vertiport operations into the current airspace. So in a city like London, which we're working on right now with the UK Civil Aviation Authority, we're sort of having a look at how the regulations currently work, where are there gaps, where might there be a need for new regulations. So to make sure not only that we're placing those vertiports in a place where there's a good business use case, but also where it can be safely integrated with all the other airspace users in such a low altitude, high density environment.
Perfect. Thank you. Diana, anything to add?
Sure. As the panelists have already mentioned, a lot needs to come together for us to actually reconfigure existing infrastructure into something that suits this new industry and new technology. And different cities have different infrastructure that's available. So if you look at a city like Los Angeles, They have 199 helipads on top of rooftops that are largely, not used or underutilized. Now, the reason why they have so many of these is because of an old city bylaw that required buildings over a certain height to have helipads on top for emergency responders to land on and access the higher parts of the buildings. But that's very, unique to LA. When you go to Chicago or New York, it's very different. So, a lot of what we're trying to do is work with different cities, both, urban, suburban, and some rural environments to really understand what kind of infrastructure is there, what are the traffic patterns, where are the needs, where we can connect communities that might have been left behind by legacy transportation networks. And then we can start to work backwards and really understand what needs to be built, what can be reconfigured and repurposed.
Got it. Thank you for that question, for that answer. That's interesting that LA has all those helipads. All right, back to Marcus. And Marcus, this is an easy question for you. How important are vertiports and the maturation of vertiport infrastructure to enable advanced air mobility operations? If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, so vertiports are crucial to AAM and its success. Similar to how aircraft operations work today, airports can tend to be a choke point in the system. Likewise, if we want these ubiquitous operations happening all the time, vertiports may be a choke point if we don't think through what's necessary for them. They also could stifle the industry if the long lead times associated with getting infrastructure in place. So we should be talking about vertiports right now. We should be kind of having investment in vertiports, starting to talk about what's necessary, where the requirements are, what needs to be standardized around vertiports. In order to get to the point in which we can have viable businesses in AAM, we really as an industry need to start talking about what is the roadmap associated with this vertiport maturation. What needs to be put in place, starting to engage with the electric grid, understanding what extensions need to happen to get power to these facilities, where they needed to be located, what types of infrastructure needs to be built up, and how does that need to mature with time in order to address the scale. So vertiports are really, really important to this ecosystem. I'm sure that hopefully that's evident to everyone that's that dialed into this. Not only the development of the vertiport, but how the vertiport is operated, how it's managed, the roles and responsibilities of the vertiport operator, the regulatory oversight of that particular vertiport. All of these things are really, really important, and they all need to be laid out. In order for us to really have a path for AAM, we need to start investing more time in figuring out the path for the ground infrastructure and what's necessary.
Thank you for that, Marcus. Lisa, back to you. As your company is thinking about different types of operations, what is your perspective on public use versus private use and scaling those operations? Where do you see majority of the use cases being? Is it in the private landscape or public uses? Any thoughts on that?
At the moment, we're building or we're doing studies on how the use cases would work, but very much from an agnostic perspective. And at least from a business model, I think we need to be looking at vertiports that are high density, that from the long term, so that you can actually get the volume of people moving. So from a private public perspective, I think that's still up in the air, but we are looking to, our vision is to have a vertiport infrastructure that is agnostic to different types of vehicles. And I think in terms of accessibility and for public acceptance, we need to probably be leaning towards a public model so that people don't see this new form of transportation as something that's very exclusive.
Got it.
But it's going to depend on where these vertiports are situated, which communities accept them, and how the use cases evolve.
Got it. And quickly improvise, because I'm seeing a lot of questions here with a similar theme. Back to you, Liza, because you're doing a study on it. Is it evident from your perspective, the return on investment for the public at this point for this technology in the near future, that we can save time, we can take a good number of people from location A to B? Is that evident to you from your research and study?
We are doing studies, and we're definitely showing that there's a time savings, but I think we need to look at the community benefits in metrics beyond just the time savings. So there are places that might be very difficult to get to right now, and so you might be trying to get from A to B, but you have to travel via sea. So that's another time savings. But from a government perspective, they don't have to put out lots of a huge infrastructure plan where you can start connecting people. So the time savings, the infrastructure cost savings is part of the benefits. I think the other sort of benefit would be looking to understand how a city's economy could diversify. So if the city's particularly focused on one industry, you can start generating jobs in the UAM industry, whether it's not just piloting, but maybe from vertiport support and aircraft maintenance. So the whole economic benefits, I think, is a starting point, but we can also look at it going into many diverse directions.
Perfect. Diana, back to you on the public versus private. What is your perspective on the majority of the use cases? Do you think it'll just be kind of all over the place, or do you see private use cases being adopted faster versus public? Any thoughts there?
So I see opportunities for both public and private from the use case perspective in terms of, consumer commercial travel versus, something like emergency response. Now, when we're talking about public versus private vertiports, in terms of accessibility to different operators and OEMs, we're likely to see a range of that as well. But I believe, fundamentally for this industry to really take off and for consumers to have choices and to really benefit, we need as much public infrastructure that's, company agnostic as possible. So if you're investing, millions of dollars to build a new road to connect two communities, you're not going to say, only one particular automaker or a car brand can drive on that road. It doesn't make sense, right? So we're hoping to see, industry really work together with developers and with city planners to make sure that as much of this infrastructure is openly accessible to the entire industry as possible.
Thank you, which helps us bring Addison to the fold. Addison, how do you do that? How do you make sure the vertiports that you're building are sort of company agnostic or platform or aircraft agnostic? As this industry is still emerging, or if that's your goal, maybe you don't want it to be agnostic.
No, we do. It's important for us to work across various OEMs. So as Skyports, we need to understand the technical requirements of the various OEMs that are currently developing those vehicles, but then also understand that even for a given aircraft manufacturer, it's not like the model that they first certify and launch with, it will be the last model that they use. So there's a bit of future proofing and thinking forward as to how these vehicles might grow out into the future as well. So there's certainly the technical requirements that is the starting point for anything that we do, whether it's the kind of the critical dimension, the size, or the charging needs, how much power we need to deliver to the site and so forth.
Got it. And a little bit of, again, improvising here. Your company must have a very sophisticated model to figure out where you put these vertiports. Can you speak about some of the trends some of the variables you're looking at when you decide where to put a vertiport? Is it population size, close proximity to an airport, presence of radar technology? what are some variables you guys look at?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, it's a couple things, and it's very much a matter of working outside of just Skyports as well, because we will not operate the vehicles, and at the end of the day, the vertiports need to be the places where where the aircraft operators want to fly. But where some of the factors that we look at is multimodal connections. So to the extent that we can co-locate near, certainly an airport would be a major demand node, a rail depot or similar. That's going to be a factor. Near dense population areas, or where commuters are converging in a central business district of some sort. Points of interest in various communities. You have areas that aren't necessarily high population centers, but it's a place where a lot of visitors go. So we factor in a lot of the all of the use cases and a lot of the demand variables to think about where we would want to place nodes. And then following that, we get into all of the technical considerations of what exact location actually works from a constructability, an airspace, a design and operations standpoint, a community acceptance standpoint. All of those considerations need to be taken into account as well.
Got it. I have a lot of improvising questions that this is giving me ideas, but back to you, Addison. What do you need from, you talked about working with OEMs. What are some specific things that, the federal government can do better, and Marcus here is representing the entire federal government, or Liza and Diana, the OEMs that can help you accelerate the Vertiport business or market?
Yeah, absolutely. I think on the community acceptance point, that's one where the whole industry and the whole ecosystem can come together to help paint the picture for the public and really generate that community acceptance. OEMs in particular have a platform as the vehicle developers. They can be really helpful in painting what that will look like for passengers and what the benefits are for them. From a regulatory standpoint, that's a place where we do need the government's support to help put out the design guidance and standards for vertiports, for example, so that there are a set of standards that we can work to in development, and that the local jurisdictions can have confidence that what we're building and what we're bringing is safe and is kind of the right design for their community. And then maybe one other thing to highlight would be one technical challenge being electrifying these sites, and just the need for grid capacity and grid resilience that doesn't exist in a lot of these sites. That's something that local and state governments alongside utilities can do by putting resources towards that expansion. And there recently was a letter that I think Hyundai, Eve, Skyports, many others were signatories to, that went to U.S. Congress requesting support in the expanding the grid capacity for vehicle charging. So that's somewhere where industry collectively sees the need and is asking the government for support.
Perfect, thank you. Now let's turn the table to Marcus. Marcus, what is your ask of industry to better partner with what NASA and FAA are doing in this space to accelerate vertiport technology and AAM?
Yeah, so I can't pretend to speak for all of the government, but some areas I think that could be very beneficial. There's a lot of noise in the industry in terms of different use cases, different applications, even different modes of operation people want to operate under. One of the things that will be helpful is if we start having some harmonization around some key use cases, some representative aircraft models and performance. That will help accelerate some of the guidance that would come out. I mean, it's very hard to really sift through the noise and understand where the priorities of industry are at in terms of determining, this type of use case with this kind of vehicle performance is our highest priority that needs the guidance right away versus something that's maybe 5 or 10 years out, right? So because of all that noise, it's it stalls progress, and it really is very taxing, I guess, on the government at large, trying to figure out where do we put the effort at? Where do we put the R&D at? Where do we put the regulatory regulation and policy at? So that would be very helpful if we can get the industry really to come around and resonate around some key use cases, a more resilient roadmap that allows us to have some gauge of where to put the effort. So those would be some of the key areas. I think I'll make a shameless plug. Obviously NASA is helping bring this ecosystem together. So participation on our ecosystem working groups and starting to talk and discuss through the problems, starting to mature the concepts. Collaboration with us on our national campaign activities and some of our automation research projects. As we start looking ahead on, how does the airspace need to change? How does the vehicle autonomy need to change? How does the procedures need to change? And trying to start to collect data to help inform what needs to change in the policy. Again, trying to accelerate those changes as best as possible.
Thank you, Marcus. Elaborating on that, do you see a role for state and local governments? Is there a gap that is not being addressed by the federal government or industry?
Yeah, so there most certainly is a role for state and local governments. One of the things to consider is that the infrastructure in vertiports and heliports, for that matter, the FAA puts out guidance for them, but doesn't necessarily have kind of regulatory oversight of those facilities. That actually comes from the state and local levels. So unless they are taking funds through something like the AIP. So if they're not taking federal funds, the state and local will determine what the requirements are for a given facility. They may refer to the FAA's guidance and say, yeah, you need to follow that, and add a few extra things, but they don't necessarily have to. What this could end up resulting in is a patchwork of different regulations, and we do see this on the heliport side to some extent. So the patchwork of regulations could be very, very challenging as we're starting to try to build out infrastructure and make sure things are compatible, and we're building routes from point A to point B. That could stall the industry. So one of the things that I think would be very, very beneficial from the state and local level is, again, to have some consistency and some standardization around how they're planning on doing their policies, how they're doing their zoning requirements, how they're building their requirements against the infrastructure build out and the operation at facilities. That would help streamline the industry quite a bit in terms of getting approval and getting these sites up and running, ready for the vehicles to start operations.
Perfect, thank you. Turning to Diana, what is your company doing in terms of when we're talking about state and local governments from a policy and legal perspective, and what opportunities or challenges do you see working with state governments?
Thank you. It's a great question. And I'll start by saying, Marcus, thank you, used my favorite word, preemption. It's very important that we maintain federal preemption over airspace and aviation safety, because the FAA has such a strong safety record over the last 50 years. It's very difficult to regulate, aviation. It's very high risk activity, and they're really best positioned to maintain that safety record. So we're very keenly interested in avoiding a patchwork at the local level. Now, that said, there are a lot of opportunities and appropriate roles for state and local governments to play in this space. And we're actively working with a lot of different cities and states, both in the United States as well as abroad, one of the primary areas is the focus of our talk here today. It's infrastructure. So, from a zoning perspective, that's under the purview of local governments. And so one of the things that we're looking to do is to work with cities to start to create model zoning legislation so that there's a regulatory and legal path for you to be able to change a rooftop or a parking deck into a vertiport. And again, we want to avoid that patchwork, so we'll be looking to work with a lot of groups like NCSL and others to create model bills that we're hoping to see get passed across the country so that we see one uniform framework. Our company has championed a couple of bills that were passed over the last few months at the state level, both in Arizona as well as Texas. What they do is they create urban air mobility task forces that bring together state regulators, lawmakers, as well as industry and other groups like people that represent groups from diversity or different mobility challenges and so forth. So really bringing in that entire network to start to look at, what laws that are currently on the books that might need to be adjusted for this industry to really thrive in the local environment, such as zoning laws, and what new laws might need to be adopted, as well as, how can we work together to bring public acceptance to the forefront of everything that we're doing and to really keep citizen concerns in mind as we bring this technology into local communities. We've also helped support standing up a fellowship program in the city of Los Angeles to look at urban air mobility and integration to transportation networks, and we're looking to do that across other cities as well. Addison mentioned a letter we all collectively wrote to the Hill before. It was one of our asks. I'll mention because it's very timely. This week, the Senate passed its infrastructure package. It's been all over the news. Very hot topic for lobbyists in DC and in transportation. There are a couple of provisions that are very relevant to our industry that we saw passed this week. It's really exciting. One of those pertains to our talk here today. It's the DOT Smart Grant Program, which provides $100 million in funding per year over the next 5 years. It's funding that's allocated by US DOT Secretary. Now it can apply for, vertiports or for urban air mobility, but also for other modes of transportation as well. But we see that as a potential vehicle for the development of vertiports across the country over the next 5 years, which is really exciting.
Thank you. Thank you for covering that, also the legislation. Liza, going back to you, and you answered this a little bit at a high level, but a little more getting into specifics on use cases. As your company is building out, you're building aircraft, what kind of use cases are emerging for you? What is the typical radius of operation? Are you thinking air taxis to airports? What are some of those very obvious use cases that are emerging for you? What is the typical range, altitude, number of customers, passengers, if you can speak to that?
I can speak to some of that. So we're looking at a use case definitely in the urban context. So there are three primarily categories. So the first one is the commuter market. And commuter doesn't necessarily mean someone who travels to and from work. So it might be someone who wants to go downtown to see a baseball game. And instead of driving all the way downtown, and I know here in San Francisco, they do metered parking that's based on demand, surge pricing. So you might end up paying $40 for parking. So you might want to sort of compare the cost benefits analysis of, oh, should I drive downtown or should I just take a UAM downtown to see the game? It could be the connection between a vertiport near someone's home to complement with a transit system. So instead of taking a very slow train that gets you to a train interchange, you might want to use that to complement your public transportation ride. So the commuter ride is one use case we're looking at. The airport shuttle is another use case. Basically, I think we're looking to help people think about flying for that last mile home. And then finally, tourism. Tourism is another way where we're thinking that a zero emissions, low noise eVTOL would be a less environmentally impactful way to particularly see environmentally sensitive areas. So they're the sort of use cases we're looking for. We're looking to examine how UAM would work more in the short range, probably at as a rule of thumb, maybe under 100 miles. And so we're not really looking at those longer trips, and I know some other companies are. But we think that at least in the next few years and at launch, it's going to be the short ride.
Got it. And back to you, there was a question that I saw coming from the audience that I've always had myself is, how are you making sure that this is affordable to most customers, or what are the customer segments that you're looking at? Is it just the wealthy, or is it most consumers? What price points do you think you can get to, Liza?
I'm not going to put a dollar value on it because it's going to depend on every market. But I think the goal, the vision, is to make it accessible to more people, maybe somewhere along the Uber X large, the Lux Uber X market. We've done some studies, and you would see an article in LinkedIn that was published a few months ago, where we're looking to see where the market is, what the price elasticity is, and so I think it was going towards something I think along the lines of $40 to $50. So it's comparable to an Uber ride, and that might not arise right at launch, but I think in the medium to long term, that is definitely where we're going to be able to get to, particularly since we're not using aviation fuel, right? These aircraft are a lot cheaper to operate. And so, as we're able to evolve towards autonomy as well, then we can potentially take the cost of the pilot out of it. That might be somewhere way down the line. But, eventually this is going to be much more accessible than what a helicopter ride, for example, is today.
Got it. Diana, anything to add to the use case as you guys are building your aircraft? What use cases you have in mind, range, altitude, and also the second question that Liza addressed. Any thoughts on that in terms of the customer base you're looking at, the customer segments?
Sure, absolutely. Similar to Liza, we're also looking at long commuters as well as airport to downtown. Those are primary use cases for a lot of the companies in the market. For the early years. We're also really interested in connecting communities that have been left behind by legacy transportation build-outs, and really bridging those gaps in places where the needs are not currently met by existing highways or bus routes or subways and so forth. We also see a lot of opportunities down the line for regional air mobility, or RAM. That's a longer range aircraft, not meant for inner city hops, but more for connecting different cities or city to suburban areas, or even rural communities that are a little bit further apart from each other. This is especially relevant in places where rail is not accessible. RAM has a much smaller infrastructure footprint. It could be stood up much quicker. It's less expensive. And so it makes a lot more sense if you're going to invest in connecting disparate communities to invest in vertiports and this type of technology, as opposed to trying to develop a new rail network or a hyperloop or something that might be a lot more expensive and time consuming. In terms of use cases, I'll mention something that's we're very focused on at Hyundai, is also making sure that our aircraft and vertiports are accessible to people with disabilities. Now, we've seen a lot of, in terms of legacy aviation or even traditional transportation, people with disabilities were often an afterthought. So the experience of traveling, if you're in a wheelchair, is not at all seamless as you can guess. But everything from how you get to the vertiport, how your wheelchair is packed, if it needs to be packed away in a cabin, or if you can actually fly in your device and so forth. All of those things, we're starting to think about. We're working with groups that represent people with different types of disabilities, both physical as well as intellectual, to really understand the challenges with transportation and trying to build that into our product portfolio from the outset so that we can be as inclusive as possible. In terms of affordability, we understand that for this to truly, take off, the way that we hope that it does, and to really change the way, people move and, transport themselves around cities and rural environments, the cost needs to be very, very accessible. And that's why, as one of the leading automakers, what we're trying to do is bring car manufacturing processes, smart manufacturing technologies that have really never been used in the aviation space into this new industry from the get-go. And so, there's a lot of work for us to do with regulators so that, they become comfortable with, the practices and the technologies and processes that they've likely never seen before, which will allow us to produce, millions of vehicles, as opposed to, a traditional aircraft OEM might only be able to have capacity to build 65 airplanes per month. What we're looking at doing is at a much broader scale. But again, a lot has to be done for that. And ultimately, we do believe those auto manufacturing processes will help drive down the cost to make it as affordable as possible for consumers.
Thank you, Diana. Pivoting to Addison, Addison, how does a vertiport builder or operator make money in this market?
Yeah, I mean, our business model is very much like an FBO, in that revenue through landing fees and recharging. So not refueling Jet A per se, but the recharging itself. So we put in the capital investment up front to build out the airfield, the terminal, the other associated infrastructure on an existing structure on which we might have a lease. And then we would allow vehicle operators to land, and we charge them a landing fee as a result. So, it's a model that's familiar within aviation today, and we think it works to align incentives and really we hope drive down the overall cost for the consumer. I think where to that discussion point we were just on, where the vertiport developer can come in a major way, is trying to really increase the utilization of these assets of the aircraft, given the relatively high fixed cost. Though I recognize that there's a major effort to bring that down. I think the implications for us are on the design of the airspace, the airfield, the terminal for passenger flow, and the electrical infrastructure, so we can do really fast charging. All of those things coming together to allow a really high throughput, which will bring the unit cost down for all the users.
Got it. And similar to Diana and Liza, based on the market research you've done, you anticipate providing services to all customers, not just certain segments that can afford it. Is that correct, Addison?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I apologize that you didn't know you were talking to me. Yeah, I mean that's absolutely our intention and aspiration, is that we are part of the solution, wherein this industry gets to a price point that is much more accessible than maybe kind of intra-urban air transit is today.
Got it. Thank you. Next question back to you, Diana. And it's a question, well, I have it on my list, but it also came from the audience. Very timely. From your perspective, what is the future of advanced air mobility and vertiport technology in the next 5 or 10 years? So at least from your company's perspective, what are you investing in for the next 5, 10 years? Where do you see the market going?
It's a great question. A lot has to come together for this market to really work out and be successful. We're targeting 2028 for entry into service in our first city. in order to get there, a lot of policy as well as ecosystem development and public acceptance, there has to be a perfect storm of all of these things that coalesce at the right time for us to be successful. We need to get our aircraft certified, as well as develop industry standards, update the zoning laws, construct the infrastructure, and work with local communities as well. At Hyundai, we're really focused on developing multimodal solutions. So you'll see that through our investment strategy, both on the aircraft, the eVTOL aircraft that our unit is developing, but also investments that the company has made in ground autonomous vehicles, as well as infrastructure to connect the two together. You'll also see, we have a great interest in integrating robotics to help with the passenger experience, security screening, and so forth. And so you'll see that come through our Boston Dynamics acquisition that was announced earlier this year. So we see a lot of opportunities for robotics and advanced, ground and air technologies to really come together. That's where we're focused on.
Got it. Marcus, how does that sound to you? Where's NASA? Where do you think this industry is going in the next 5-10 years? You just published a Vertiport automation study report. What's next?
Yeah, no, and the study speaks for itself, honestly. No, I think we're all heading kind of in the same direction here. I take maybe a different angle on it because I'm doing R&D. What we're focusing on over the next 5 to 10 years is trying to get some of the enabling technology mature enough such that we can have what we had called a UML4 vision, where there's hundreds of aircraft flying in kind of these urban centers. Specifically on the Vertaport side, what we're looking at is trying to enable at least 120 movements per hour to define kind of medium to high density type of throughput. So how do you get that type of throughput? We're going to need pieces, and again, I'm being a little selfish here talking about our research. You may need some pieces of automation. You may need some communication, navigation, and surveillance type of equipment on the physical infrastructure in order to enable kind of rapid communication, vehicle to infrastructure communication, potentially even vehicle to vehicle communication, looking at how you can schedule operations, how you can be adaptable to changes, delays, how you can be cognizant of situations that come in, such as weather, and how you're even aware of things on the surface like FOD that may be potential hazardous to operations. So all of these things, if you're trying to do it at, again, these higher throughput type of operations, you may need some automation in order to support that. And that's really where some of our R&D is focused on, at least on my particular sub-project. We have a very diverse portfolio at NASA. National Campaign, I think, is a good example. We're taking kind of today's system and we're kind of pivoting, we're kind of anchoring in today's regulation and evolving and really understanding kind of what are the next steps going forward in order for us to build out the infrastructure. My sub-project's looking a little bit further ahead and saying, how do we enable the scalability? And then we have some of our complementary work in our other projects at ATMX that's looking at what type of structures need to be in place for the airspace management, and how does that airspace management interact with the Vertaport environment, and where are the roles and responsibilities between the Vertaport operator, between the pilot, between the fleet manager, between the airspace management system and ATC for that matter. So all of these things need to come together in order for us to kind of envision or enable these higher throughput operations. I think we can get there, start getting these operations going within 5 to 10 years. So we're focused very much on what research is necessary in order to get these enablers mature enough for the industry to really take them and run with them.
Thank you, Marcus. Liza, anything to add? Do you see it differently the next 5-10 years? Can I get on Air Mobility aircraft next time I'm at an airport to get downtown?
Well, by the time this pandemic's over, maybe, or looking at that sort of a time frame. And I completely agree with Marcus. I think the biggest challenge is going to see how the whole airspace system is going to work together. So at Eve, we were looking at that about 3 years ago. So we wrote a white paper back then, back in 2018. I think we published it in 2019, Flight Plan 2030. And that was really talking about all the services that are going to be needed to integrate the Vertiport with ATC, with drones, with the fleet operator, with the eVTOL pilots. We sort of looked at what sort of a services, what sort of technology. We collaborated with L3Harris and ATEC, the ATM software developer that is part of the Embraer subsidiary. And then we sort of took that Flight Plan 2030 into our work with Air Services Australia and tried to use it as a sort of foundation for our use case. And that's when we started to look at, well, what will the air traffic controllers need to know? What will the situation awareness requirements be? And it was really interesting because trying to figure out what is the airspace infrastructure, how are we going to integrate it? We sort of were really challenging that idea that things can just operate as they are now for everyone to get going. Because I mean, that is the idea. Let's use the current airspace structure. Let's use, say, helicopter routes. And so we wanted to see, well, what sort of limitations does that have? How far will that get us? And in our simulation that we did with Air Services Australia, we found that when we had 4 aircraft in the airspace simultaneously, that maxed out the cognitive workload of the tower controllers. And so that we started to see delays. And being with an eVTOL and a limited battery capacity, the ability to hover is pretty limited. So that's when it really hit home the importance of making sure we integrate the vertiport capacity with the airspace capacity and making sure everyone can run like clockwork. And the automation that Marcus is working on is really going to be a big part of that. And in Eve, we're also developing software systems that will help to supplement that.
Very cool. Thank you. Addison, anything to add for your perspective on the future?
Yeah, I mean, I would broadly agree with what has been said here. I think that autonomy ultimately is going to be a big unlock, but there's going to be some time until we get there. In the interim, there are a lot of advances that can be made on both battery technology and the airspace integration, which are going to be meaningful unlocks to use cases and the volume of aircraft that we'll see.
Got it. So Addison, back to you. Since you're a global company and you're building vertiports globally, are there some trends you've seen globally, best practices that you want to highlight that can be used domestically here in the US or other places? Some good trends.
Yeah, I mean, there really are pretty meaningful differences across regions in the degree to which the government intends to be involved in vertiport development. Diana and Hyundai will know this better than anyone, but Korea, their government has taken a very coordinated approach to AAM as a consortium named UAM Team Korea that has published a roadmap through 2035, and it is clear that they want to take a very deliberate approach to launching AAM. Don't mind taking a few years up front to sort of figure out the feasibility. So that's just one example. Whereas the U.S. By contrast is not at the federal level being quite as top down in the way it wants to manage the rollout of AAM. Part of that is just the existing aviation context and culture of different regions as a starting point. So where I see local and state governments, sort of somewhat specifically in the U.S. Getting involved in helping the industry and helping vertiport development is sort of two things. One, clarifying some of those zoning and permitting and regulatory issues. Marcus was talking about a potential patchwork that may persist early on, and that's just challenging for any vertiport developer who's trying to launch it in different locations and having to deal with a different set of regulations and requirements at each one. So, something, somewhat consistent. And then two, local and state governments are often directly involved in the development of other transport infrastructure, rail depots as an example. Even if like an extensive regular AAM operation is years away in a given metro area, it's possible that those projects can future-proof the design and to allow for vertiports in the future, whether that's provisioning spare grid capacity or reinforcing the structure so that something could sit and land on the roof. It's much less expensive to do it up front than it is to come in and do a retrofit solution at a later date. So I'd highlight those as a couple ways in which state and local can help facilitate the growth of the industry.
Addison, what do you think we as a group can do, stakeholders of this industry, to educate developers? I was speaking to a developer in Thailand a few weeks ago, and they were asking, what should we consider as we're building this new city center to make it Vertiport, AAM, drone compatible? And so they were asking the right question, but there are a lot of developers now that are probably not asking those questions. Do you think a big marketing campaign from us, these stakeholders, to make sure they are thinking about these things, city planners, developers, are you guys doing a lot of outreach with developers and city planners, urban planners?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and we do try to explain the various factors that go into a good site for a vertiport, frankly. And I mentioned the multimodal depot, like a rail depot as an example where you might do this. But I think speaking to developers of other kinds and explaining what we would look for in a vertiport, so that as they're kicking off a new development, they are aware of whether it might be suitable in the future. If they're building a building in the middle of a bunch of high rises and it would be, in effect in some kind of urban canyon, that might not ever be a good location for a vertiport because the airspace is just too constrained. So I wouldn't suggest that they reinforce their roof and put megawatt chargers on the roof, because it probably won't make sense actually. But if it meets some of those basic structural requirements, like near other modes of transport, having clear airspace, then I think an education campaign can be helpful for things like the structural supports, as well as frankly the customer journey, getting from street level to the vertiport itself. That's non-trivial, and that can be built in early on.
Got it. Thank you for that answer, Addison. Marcus, kind of putting a plug for your Vertiport study, and I know John Daniels is in the audience too, who led that study as part of our team. Anything that stood out for you as big insights for that Vertiport automation study that either you didn't anticipate or was a big aha moment? For me personally, and this is not going to sound very exciting to most people on this call, I personally hadn't considered, or I hadn't thought about all the security procedures you need, TSA involvement for these vertiports, screening. And so that was interesting. Anything that really stood out for you, Marcus, from that study?
Yeah, well, first off, just big shout out to New Air and the New York test site and Deloitte and Crown and ATM, Mosaic, and all the folks that participated in that study. I hope we can provide the links at some point to make sure folks can have access and read that study. But yeah, there's a number of things that kind of popped out to me. Just the interplay between what's needed in terms of supporting infrastructure and the limited footprint and space constraints that we may want to work in. We often kind of talk about these urban centers, but as you start increasing the throughput of operations, maybe one takeoff and landing area isn't sufficient, right? We need to start talking about how many is the minimum amount and can you fit that on a rooftop, right? You know, I think there's some very interesting discussion in that. Like you had mentioned, the security and screening aspect, the passenger management technology, how you're moving people and vehicles on the surface, understanding that there is navigation challenges, particularly in these urban environments, and really how to deal with that. The small UAS community is having to kind of deal with that as they're starting to deploy out to the cities, but that may also be a challenge for AAM as well. Just cybersecurity in general. Also how information and data moves throughout the system. What type of protections do you need to place in order to ensure that no data is being compromised, there isn't certain threat planes that are being exposed, and information isn't causing people or systems to make poor decisions. And then obviously, a lot of the challenges that had already been discussed, the aircraft certification, the state and local zoning, and then I think initially going in, I probably held the opinion that heliports, it's an easy thing to just convert those over. I think that the study kind of showed me maybe it's not so easy as I had originally thought, and particularly again as we talk about scalable operations. Maybe in the near term it's a solution, but in the far term, it may not be practical. So the study is very interesting. It covered technology, infrastructure policy, and some community considerations, and then expanded on that into a vision of the future through a ConOps, and then even talking about how a vertiport automation system can help support that vision of the future and some requirements around that. So definitely, again, a bit of a plug, but folks definitely go and check out that study. It's all publicly available and releasable at this point.
Thank you, Marcus. I did. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, Marcus, we've been looking at some airport studies as well, and in addition to the challenges raised about TSA, and do we move passengers from landside to airside, or do they go through some sort of screening downtown before they go over, and therefore they're going to have to be all sterile and land in and the airside of the airport. So they're all questions that need to be addressed. But on top of that is the baggage question. So if you have passengers who are they're good at traveling with just a rollerboard, that's fine. But what if you have passengers now who don't understand the meaning of traveling light, and they have to have their 230-pound bags with them, and then you have a whole family like that, and then what do you do? So maybe I don't know, it creates a new need for maybe it's someone's opportunity to have a new luggage service that are companies that you can tell. It's all these little logistic things start to snowball.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that the ground movement and the ground operations is something I don't hear many people talking about right now. And I think it is going to be more challenging than it seems. So I definitely agree.
Yeah, we're starting to look at it from the very nuts and bolts level instead of just being a theoretical journey. Well, if you were a real person traveling from A to B, what are you going to do with your stuff? When are you going to go through security? And we're also looking at accessibility. And what if you do have someone with a wheelchair, and what is the load of the aircraft, and what is the ability to turn that aircraft around? And I think one of the challenges is going to be trying to carry people with disabilities who use electric wheelchairs, because those things are heavy and they're big.
Thank you, Liza. I think we're slowly getting close to the end. I see a lot of questions, and the beauty of having this virtual session is that some of the audience members are answering some of the questions, which is fantastic. It's like a forum almost, and that's great. I did include the link in the chat for the NASA study. Liza, some people are asking for your study, if you could put a link in there
Sure.
for everyone. And I tried to cover at least some of the questions asked by the audience. Some of the other questions are a bit too technical, I think, for this panel. But a question for everyone, I think it's a concluding question. We can start with Diana, and you may have already addressed this. And again, assuming most of the audience here is from traditional aviation, helicopter, any major takeaways for them from your perspective? What do you think they should know about the coming world of Vertiport, AAM tech area, anything you want to mention?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's worth highlighting that the workforce opportunities in this new emerging sector within aviation are massive. I know Deloitte and Morgan Stanley and others have put out tons of figures. You know, everyone says it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, even within the United States by 2030, 2035. What's really exciting is that we have an opportunity to create an entirely new workforce in aviation. And to bring in younger people and women and minorities and people that are not playing, a leading role in traditional aviation. What's also exciting is that a lot of jobs will be located right in the communities where the operations will be. So unlike traditional aviation, there's a few skilled experts in certain hubs in the country that actually are skilled and understand how to fix mechanical issues in traditional planes. So you have to haul a plane across the country in order to have it serviced. There's a lot of downtime and not a huge workforce that's skilled in that respect. What we think is necessary for this model to take off is something more similar to the auto shop model. So right in the local communities near the vertiports, there will be a skilled labor pool that actually knows how to fix these aircraft. What's also exciting is we're taking a lot of complexity out of the engine, so to speak, since we're looking at electric propulsion technology here. And so we're looking to develop that workforce in tandem with cities and with educational institutions and other partners. And so that would be my big takeaway here is that, there are a lot of exciting opportunities in this industry. And, we're looking forward to traditional aviation players as well as, new players to participate and have an active role.
Thank you, Diana. That reminds me, plug, we Deloitte did do a study with AIA recently. We published it, and we anticipate this being a $115 billion market by 2035. That includes both passenger and cargo advanced air mobility operations, and kind of a even split between the two by 2035 and 17 billion by 2025. And about creating 300,000 jobs in this space. And by 2042, we anticipate operations in multiple cities with full automation. So I'll share the link to that study as well. All right, question for you, Marcus. Same question. Any takeaways for this audience? Any last words?
Yeah, I think well, the future is bright. I think this is going to be a very exciting area for the next couple of decades. Honestly, NASA is really very dedicated to enabling this AAM vision. We've put together some ecosystem working groups, so I do really encourage folks to go and participate in those. They're open to anyone. Go give your opinions, help mature the concepts, participate in our national campaigns, partner with us through our various projects that are working on, the airspace, the vehicle considerations, vehicle autonomy, noise, vertiport autonomy. I think there's a lot of opportunity to work together to make this a reality and make it a reality soon, right? So we look forward to the future and very happy to work with everyone to make that future happen.
Thank you, Liza.
This is a really exciting time to be in aviation. I think this is a time where we have a great opportunity for all these different stakeholders to contribute. We want to hear from communities, from vertiport operators, from builders and property developers, from state and federal bodies, and to tell us what is it that you're looking for. On the flip side, as an OEM, we would also like to better understand, and maybe this message is more for FAA, what is the threshold that OEMs need to meet in order to get certified for autonomy? Right now, that's not really clear. So what criteria do we need to be able to address in order to show that the safety of these vehicles will meet or even exceed an acceptable level, and what does acceptable mean? So I think that's a big question right now for the regulator.
Perfect. Last but not least, Addison, any major takeaways?
Yeah, I think I'd like people on this call to understand that advanced air mobility, it's primarily about expanding access to aviation. It's not a drop-in zero-sum replacement of existing aviation. There'll be plenty of use cases for which conventional traditional modes will remain the baseline, and AAM will be a complement. I think corollary to that, and similar to what others have said, in order for the AAM industry to be successful and take off, it needs the support and, frankly, the guidance of traditional aviation.
Fantastic. With that, I think that's about it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panel members, Addison, Marcus, Lisa, Diana, for your insights.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, HAI, and thank you, audience, for all the great questions. Dan, over to you.
I'd like to add my appreciation to that as well. Sevan, Addison, Diana, Marcus, and Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time to share your knowledge, your perspectives. As Lisa said, this is a really exciting time to be entering this industry, this evolution of the rotorcraft industry. And so I can't tell you how much we appreciate that you took the time out to join us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
As always, I do have a few things to wrap up today. As I mentioned, this is part one of a three-part series on advanced air mobility. August 26th, I'm going to jump around my schedule just a little bit. August 26th, we have the advanced air mobility update, a view from the top. We have some top C-suite level executives who will come in and talk about their perspective on regulatory and policy issues, including a former administrator of the FAA. Because of the scheduling for these people, we are going to have to change our start time. That will be 5 p.m. on August 26th. So it's going to be an hour later than what we normally do. We will be sending out announcements for that, but do watch for it. On September 2nd, we will follow up with the final version of the advanced air mobility update, and that's going to be international perspectives. It's going to be the same high-level policy discussion, but it's going to be from the international perspective. I know that we have panelists literally from around the globe who will join us for that webinar. And I think it's going to be a really exciting conclusion to this three-part series. To jump back into my schedule a little bit, August 19th next week, we are going to have a representative from the Department of Homeland Security coming in to talk about their Blue Lightning initiative. And this is how to recognize and stop human trafficking. We don't often think that it can occur in our industry. Apparently it does. And so we are asking everybody's help to come in and listen to what we can, how to identify it and how to stop this horrible issue around the world. We will have a follow-up questionnaire coming to you very shortly. We are always interested in what you thought worked and didn't work on these webinars. We are grateful that you take a time to share your opinions. Let us know. And if there's any upcoming topics you'd like us to add, perhaps something that you heard today keyed off an idea about a future advanced air mobility topic, we'd love to hear about it. We'd also like to know if there's anything that HAI can do for you that we're not doing for you, that we could do better. Best way to do that is to address Jim Viola, our president and CEO, who's not available right now. He's on vacation, a well-deserved vacation. Let him know through the email address president@rotor.org with your challenges, your questions, your feedback. He does read every one of those emails, and he does task our staff with responding. Please stay on top of our VTOL news and issues. Visit our new rotormedia.com site. It's just loaded with content. Our Rotor Daily e-newsletter, summing up all the VTOL news from around the world in one central location. And Rotor Magazine, produced for and by the VTOL industry. There's some amazing photos, some great stories, some really amazing insight in that magazine as well. We can also have these things delivered right to you. Easiest way to get Rotor Magazine, I bet you a lot of you guys miss print magazines, and this is a great publication to see. It's not something that's going to just go out of date right away. Rotor Daily can come to your email box. We've now got a new Rotor Now app. We're looking at evolving it as well with the latest VTOL news on your phone. If you go to rotor.org/subscribe, you can sign up for all three of those. The Rotor Now app will provide a link to the iPhone store and to the Google store for those of you with those phones. That does wrap us up for this week. Gosh, we appreciate your engagement. This is, we had a lot of questions. We had a lot of people chatting. It shows how important this topic is and how much interest there is in this topic. We appreciate that you took the time to attend. Until next week, we ask that you be safe, that you fly safe, and we'll see you again very, very soon.